Today we are standing on Har Herzl, where Herzl was buried, a place that looked totally different at that time than it does today. Israel's gone through a lot of changes over the years that we're going to hear about a lot today. Today we commemorate Yom Hazikaron, Israel's official Remembrance Day, dedicated to the fallen soldiers as well as being extended to civilian victims of terror. Our gratitude could not be expressed enough for these incredibly courageous individuals who fought whilst defending our precious state of Israel. And whilst every day we must remember them, today the whole of Israel stops in honor of them. We honor their memory and everything they fought for. We in our United Synagogue shuls stand every Shabbat morning and recite the prayer for the state of Israel and the IDF. So join us today as we learn about some of these incredibly courageous individuals. We are delighted to be here today with Tzvi Sperber from JRoots.
So we've come up on the path which leads from Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust memorial below us. The place, of course, that commemorates the 6 million Jews that perished in the Holocaust. Now there's a definite connection between the two hills, because as we walked up this hill over here, we have now arrived onto Har Herzl. In the background you can hear the music of the band, getting ready for Yom Ha'atzmaut, for Israel's Independence Day. And that in itself is a whole issue which is so hard for the families who lost people to be able to get their heads around. Because we've arrived now to the part of the mountain which is going to deal with all of those people who have fought bravely. And we're talking about from 1873, which is the first grave that is recognized, until today. Soldiers that have set their lives down in order to be able to make sure that me and you, wherever you may be, can come here to this country, to be able to be free people here. There's a way that they decided to develop the city. Herzl's grave was placed here, on top of a mountain in a barren area, and at the same time, they had already put a memorial to the Holocaust, a very small one down below. On the next mountain across was the Knesset. So you have, if you want to understand, you've got at the bottom of the mountain, you have Yad Vashem, 6 million Jews who perished. But there was a rebirth of the people. Remember, a couple of weeks ago, we celebrated Pesach. We sat around our Seder tables. We said the famous words of V'hi she'amda l'avotenu. In every generation, somebody comes to try and destroy the Jewish people. But there will always be salvation. And even from the depths of the depths, there was a possibility, God willing, that we were able to once again lift ourselves up, and we've proven that. We climbed up the mountain just like we did now, to this part over here, to the place where we're about to enter into the military cemetery, where over 3,500 soldiers are buried. People who set their lives down in the various different wars. And continuing up on the topography of Jerusalem, you get to the next hill along, which is the Knesset. All of this is linked together. This idea of the sacrifice that people have made always to be able to live here. And that's something we're going to be introduced to as we walk through here. And one of those things that we need to remember all the time as we walk through here is the sensitivities to people. To remind us constantly this idea of the families that lost so many of their loved ones, and they unfortunately have come to be able to remember them. One of the first places that we get to when we come up from the path that links us from Yad Vashem to Har Herzl is a monument that unfortunately today is covered in scaffolding called Netsarcon, which means, if you want, the remnants, the last remnants. Those Jews that arrived on the shores of Israel, and the first thing they were given was a gun. We need you to fight for our independence. When Jews came from the Holocaust, they were asked the question. And Har Herzl Schachter, who was one of the American soldiers who got to Buchenwald, asked the kids there, after taking them to a sanatorium called Ikwi, where do you want to go to? Do you want to go to Israel, or do you want to come back to America with me? And the vast majority of them wanted to come to Israel, seeing this as their hope, just like the Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem, speaks about. They arrived to these shores. Some of them were very lucky, came here in 1945, and were put back into other camps by the British, of course at Lit and other places like that, as we know. But 3 years later, the War of Independence will break out, and most of those people will only arrive here on the eve of that war. Netsarcon, the last remnant of those people who came here, who realized where they'd come from, and then understood, what are we fighting for? We're going to head in now to the 1948 area, which deals, of course, with the first major war that Israel had to fight for its existence. Come this way. So we're standing now in what's known as the paratrooper circle. This area over here, which looks like a mitznach, looks like a parachute, as you can see. And you'll notice on all the graves over here, you can see the parachute. Now, on most of the graves that you'll be able to see the word on the top, which says lezecher, which means in memory of. This means that we don't have their bodies, unfortunately. But what we do have is one of the most famous ones, which is here. A woman named Hannah Senish that I'm sure many of you have heard of. Hannah Senish, of course, was born in Europe, finally makes her way to Israel, and moves to a kibbutz called Kibbutz Sdot Yam, which is next to Caesarea, next to Caesarea of today. For those of us who have been to the archaeological remnants that are there from the Roman period, okay, her kibbutz sits just there on the shores of Caesarea. All of these people realized their calling when they came to Israel. And that's not just to be able to settle the land, but they also understood about the terrible horrors that had taken place in Europe. Some of them had come from Poland, and those horrors had started already in 1939. Some of them had come from Germany, and of course their story of the Holocaust started in 1933. And there are others who came from the area of Hungary. Hungary were really coming to the war from 1944. And for the last year of the war, of course, there will be an utter destruction of Hungarian Jewry. Rudolf Hess will receive a letter from Adolf Eichmann, who was in Budapest at the time, explaining to him just after the last day of Pesach, where they take the Jews out of their homes, most of them on the last day, on the 7th day, and they move them into makeshift ghettos, which are these brick buildings in places like Munkac and other places like that, that he's going to have to get ready to be able to deal with a very large transportation. They want to be able to kill all 600,000 Jews of Hungary within 6 weeks. Thankfully, they were unable to do that. 450,000, unfortunately, will perish, but they don't manage to completely wipe off the face of the earth Hungarian Jewry. One of those last bastions that was standing was in Budapest. The Jews of Israel, as I said before, understood their concept of building the land, but also taking care of their brethren who were in Europe. And they decided the best way to do that was to be able to join the British Army, to have what's known as the Gedud HaIvri, the Jewish Brigade. Within the Jewish Brigade, there are a few select people, and they asked for some volunteers. And what you're looking at here are those people who were prepared to parachute beyond enemy lines to be able to help out not just the Jews, that was their ulterior motive, but the British wanted them, of course, to help out the freedom fighters within Europe, the partisans, and those people fighting against the Nazis. Hannah Senish will parachute herself into Hungary, and she is caught and is taken to prison. She refuses to speak. So they try the next tactic. They bring her mother into the cell. They tell her they're going to kill her mother. She again keeps her mouth shut. Hannah Senish is shot in Budapest in 1945. She falls after trying to help out the people of Budapest, the Jewish people, and of course take messages to help out the people who were fighting the Nazis at the time. You know, she left us, though, some of the most amazing writings. And one of those is, of course, the famous songs of Eli, Eli, Shaloi Gamer Le'olam. Hachol v'ayam Rishush shel hamayim, v'rak hashamayim tfilat ha'adam. The idea of, my God, I pray that these things will never end. The beauty of nature the sand and the sea, hearing the waves of Stotz Yam, the kibbutz that she so much loved and she came from. But unfortunately, her dream that she dreamt to come to the land of Israel will come to an abrupt end in 1945. Yeh Zichra Baruch, may her memory be blessed. And we have so much to be thankful for, that she left us as a memory. Chana Senish and the other people who parachuted into Europe. So we're standing now in an area of Har Herzl which is connected to 1948. Har Herzl itself is split up according to the wars, according to different things that took place. There's even a whole area here that's dealing with the terrorist attacks. And that is why Yom Hazikaron is known as the day of the memorial for the Israeli soldiers and those who have fallen, unfortunately, victims of terror. But next to us now, or next to me now, is this woman, Esther Sailing Gold. She connects to each and every one of us. Because as you can see from her grave, she's the son of Hannah and Moshe Leib. She's born in England, Nolda Anglia. She came to live in Israel in 1946. She fell in the Battle of Jerusalem on the 20th of Iyar, Tafshin Chet. That means that she fell just a few days after the Declaration of Independence. That's basically as well the story that we're going to be telling now, which connects to something completely incredible what this girl did. She was a young girl born, as I said, in London. She's, by the way, born in Whitechapel. The family will finally then move to Stamford Hill. The father is in charge of the Mizrahi movement. The grandfather, back in Poland, was a chassid, a Karliner chassid, but was a Zionist. He was at the Third Zionist Congress. And this idea of Zionism was very much embedded in her family. She desperately wanted to come to the land of Israel. But I think what really gave her that impetus was the concept of one day when people who had arrived from the Holocaust came to the shores of England to be looked after. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the story of the Windermere children. But there were other cases as well where children came from Europe and were looked after in various different places. She also volunteered with kids that came out of the terror and the horror of the Holocaust. But that wasn't enough for her. One Shabbat, she receives mail, desperately waits to open it up, opens up the mail to see that she had been accepted to something that her parents didn't even know she'd applied for. A girl, as we said, who had grown up in Whitechapel, Stamford Hill, gone to North London Collegiate, then gone on to Goldsmiths and won one of the awards in Goldsmiths as being such a great student, had applied to get a teaching job that the British had allowed one of the Jewish schools in Israel to open up positions for. In Evelina de Rothschild's school, she was going to be the history and the English teacher in Jerusalem. Dancing for joy, she told her parents were so happy for her, and her father and her made their way in 1946 to Israel. They came here, father had come also to be able to see his father, who was now living in Tel Aviv. And for the next year, she taught quite happily in Evelina de Rothschild, history and English to the students. But then, as we all know, the winds of war were coming to Israel. 1947, even though we've had many terrorist attacks up until that, there's a feeling, of course, that Israel itself should be granted this possibility to have its own state. On the 29th November 1947, in late success, the UN vote to allow the Jewish people to have a country alongside an Arab country. But if you think the War of Independence broke out in 1948 after the Declaration of Independence by Ben Gurion in Tel Aviv, then you need to look again at your history. Because in 1947, on the 29th of November, when the horrors, those beautiful dances were being danced in the streets, as people sat next to their radios to be able to listen to that vote, and we finally got the possibility that we were going to be getting a country, The Arab nations around were obviously less than enthused by this. And the war will basically break out. Women are not taken to the front lines, even though they are part of the Haganah. They're part of the defense forces. But she is used for her special skills. She's finally able to be taken to a base in Jerusalem. They train her, and they see this woman's a great sniper. But still, Ben-Gurion's given this blanket ban on women going to the front. Because of her English, she becomes the broadcaster of the Haganah in English to the British soldiers, to hopefully try and persuade them that they shouldn't take part in what the British government were doing at the time. But then finally, one day, the British allowed a convoy of teachers into the old city, a place that was surrounded and under siege by this time pretty much. The Jordanians were all over the place there. The Arabs were inside, but she got into the old city. She wanted to be able to help out as much as she could to the soldiers that were there. There were about 1,600 Jews in the old city at the time. And she would run from post to post. She would deliver food from place to place. She even, as a sniper, would utilize her skills as well. She was sent to go to the Zion Gate in the old city to pick up a bag of grenades that the Palmach, the Plugat Machat, the striking force of the Israeli army, had delivered there. She heads to the Zion Gate, and on her way back, she's shot. One other person is with her. She makes sure that he takes the grenades to the forces that need them, and she crawls basically across the old city to the Mizgav Ladach hospital. She gets there screaming in pain because she's been shot. They have no morphine to help her. They do what they can to patch her up. And they haven't got, as I said, any way to dull the pain. So they give her, for the first time in her life, a cigarette. Maybe the nicotine will help. When the doctor turns around to make sure that she's okay, she's already got off the stretcher because she knows time is imminent and you need to help as many people as possible. And she's running back and forth between the different places, wherever she can get to. But on one of those missions, they know they have to get to a certain house in the old city. She breaks into the house, and they bomb the house, and the house collapses on her. And she's finally pulled out of the rubble, very badly injured. She's taken back to the area of the hospital. It's a Friday night. She's bleeding out, and lying next to her is a man called Rav Shah Yeshua Cohen, who we know today as being the chief rabbi of Haifa. Shah Yeshuv is also the famous son of another extremely famous rabbi in Israel, who's known as the Nazir. The Nazir, a great friend of Rabbi Kook, of Rav Kook. Lying beside her, he was the one who gave us the testimony, her last words. Again, they had no way to dull the pain, and so one of the doctors lit a cigarette to give her, and her last words were this: "It's Shabbat. I can't smoke on Shabbat." And she dies. Esther Salin Gold wrote a number of letters to her parents. And I think the last letter says it all for us. This was her last letter to her mother and her father. Dear Mummy and Daddy and everybody, if you get this at all, it will be, I suppose, typical of all my hurried, messy letters. I'm writing it to beg of you that whatever may have happened to me, you will make an effort to take it in the spirit that I want to, and understand that for myself and I have no regrets. We have had a bitter fight. I have tasted of Gehenna, of hell, but it has been worthwhile, because I'm quite convinced that in the end, we will see a Jewish state and the realization of our longings. I shall be only one of many who fell in sacrifice, And I was urged to write this because one in particular was killed today who meant a great deal to me. Because of the sorrow I felt, I want you to take it to others, to remember that we were soldiers and had the greatest and the noblest cause to fight for. God is with us, I know, in the holy city of Jerusalem, and I'm proud and I'm ready to pay the price it may cost us to reprieve it. She ends off the letter by telling them that I'm thinking of you all, every single one of you in the family. I'm full of pleasure at the thought that you will one day, very soon, I hope, come and enjoy the fruits of that for which we are fighting. Much, much love, be happy and remember me in happiness. Shalom and lehitraot, your loving Esther. Her last letter to her parents. They made it here to see the fruits of what she fought for. But all around her now, as you can see, when the camera pans to the left and the right, you will notice the fighters of the old city who fought with her, trying to hold on to something that unfortunately we lost, and only 19 years later we regained. Esther Sailing Gold. So in 1948, when the soldiers, as we said, arrived on the boats coming from Europe, finally to this place over here, many of them, as we said, were given the gun for the first time. And therefore, we come across a whole section over here where you're going to come across various different graves that say on this word, Alamoni, unknown, unknown. Nafal b'krav b'Yerushalayim, he fell in the battle to Jerusalem on the Daled Nisan Tafshin Chet, but they didn't know who he was. How is that possible? They didn't know who this person was. So remember, we said they came, they were given a gun, and they were sent to battle. Nobody even registered them. Can you fight? Yes, I can fight. Great. And they sent them off. Today, when you go into the army, there's a whole process. Okay, you start your process from the age of 16 in Israel, actually. You get your letter from the army, and then you go for your first tests. At the age of 17, they try you out again. And then by the time you're 18, you're either deferring a little bit or you're going into the army then. And many times you're going in with friends of yours. But of course, they've got all the records about you. But that was not the case in the chaos that was taking place here between 1947 and 1948. Remember, the British leave, the Jews bring in as many people as possible. And I don't think there's any country in history that has had so many refugees coming into its borders at one time as Israel did until the middle of the 1950s. Many of these people, as we said, were not registered. And many of them also didn't speak Hebrew. There's a famous story with Ariel Sharon, one of the past prime ministers of Israel, who of course was a great soldier in his time. He fought in the Battle of Latrun, which is not far from where we are, and though we have trees in front of us today, if we were to look out in the distance, we'd actually see the hill of Castel. The next hill along after you go down the valley is Latrun. Latrun was a British police station that they utilized in order to put Jews in prison, as many of them were. Latrun, the Russian compound, or Akko. But when they left, they gave the position to the Arabs. And the Jews needed to be able to take that position in order to be able to take the road to Jerusalem, to be able to make sure that they could break the siege in Jerusalem. The siege was very heavy here. I mean, if we think about it today, a regular bottle of water is 1.5 liters. They were allowed to have 7 of these bottles to be able to last a whole day for a family. That meant washing, cooking, cleaning, drinking, going to the bathroom, whatever, all within that small amount of water. They need to break the siege. They need to bring medical goods up here. They need to bring ammunition as well to the soldiers, as we said already, that were fighting in the old city. Ariel Sharon was in charge of one of the brigades in the Latrun area. He turned to his soldiers and started to speak to them. And there was this blank face. People didn't look as if they understood him. Sharon turned to his commanders. He said, when you spoke to them, did they respond? Did they understand? He said, no, it was the same type of thing. Ariel Sharon turned back and started speaking in Russian. And then finally they understood him. Because they come from the post, they didn't understand Hebrew. They went to their battle in Latrun, and many of them didn't even understand the basic orders of retreat, for instance. And when they gave their order to retreat because the wheat fields of Latrun were burning because the Jordanians set them afire, many of them were killed, burnt alive. And we have no record of who these people are. That is why, to this very day, from that time, within the code of ethics of the Israeli army is we never leave a soldier behind. We make sure and we do whatever we can to bring their body back. This man, we don't know who he is. We do all of our efforts still to this very day to try and understand who these Almoni are. But if you follow us now through the story of the fighters of Jerusalem, somebody came from Czechoslovakia, from Hungary, born in Jerusalem. Some of these people were born in Haifa, Tel Aviv, and many other areas around the world. We come to another very sad story. And that's the story over here of this grave. And there are very few graves that you will ever see that looks like this. Because this is a double grave. The grave of Yosef Papiko and David Driko. That was their nicknames anyway. As you can see in the middle, it says Chaim, B'nai Charlotte v'Avraham. Okay, that was their name. Yosef Chaim, David Chaim. They were the sons of Charlotte and Avraham. Both their sons and their only sons, unfortunately, were killed here, fighting in various different battles in Jerusalem. One in the Russian compound of Jerusalem, and one in Neve Yaakov, which sits out towards Pisgat Ze'ev today, in the area towards, for those of you familiar with Israel, towards Bet El, okay, and Psagot. They were very, very poor. They had to flee because of the Nazis. They managed to get to France. From France, they finally managed to get to Turkey. And then only after the 29th of November 1947, after that famous vote, did they finally come to Israel. When they arrived in Israel, they were so poor, they managed to get themselves an apartment. But they talk about the idea that they had managed to buy as follows: a box to be able to sit on, 3 boxes to be able to sit on, and a table. They slept on the floor in the beginning. It was a very tough time to be here. But as the call came for the soldiers to go to war, they didn't hesitate. Yosef or Papiko, and Driko, as he was nicknamed, both of them didn't hesitate. Yosef will fall first. Word gets to the family and they sit Shiva in Yerushalayim. But as things were becoming harsher and harsher in Jerusalem, David realized he also had to go to battle. And on the last day of the Shiva, somebody comes in and says, we need all the help we can get. David got up. You would expect Charlotte, the mother, to say, please stay, stay. But Charlotte opens the door and says to her son, go and do what you need to do. Go and save this country. It brings us to the famous story of Chaim Shapiro and Baruch Shapiro. During the War of Independence, he lost his son. He'd lost everything else during the Holocaust. And his only son he lost here. A story that's told by Shlomo Carlebach and by many others, Stuart Weiss as well, tell us the story of at the funeral of his son, the son who had fought for independence of the Jewish people, after he'd lost everything, his whole family in the Shoah. The words of Am Yisrael Chai were sung here. The words of the people of Israel will live, and they're alive, were sung in Har Herzl. And they thought he'd gone crazy. The father had gone mad, he's burying his last son. What's happened? But he turns to the people who were there at the funeral, and he says, my other children I lost in the Holocaust. I now lost a son fighting for the land of Israel. And I think that's something which is connected to that beautiful verse that we say after a shiva. You go to a shiva, you say the words, Hamakom Yenachem Echem B'toch Sha'ar Evelei Yom Yerushalayim. May the Almighty comfort you amongst all the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. The word Hamakom, surely it'd say, may Hashem comfort you. But it doesn't. It says Hamakom, the place. When you stand in Har Herzl and you listen to that story of Baruch Shapiro, you start to understand Hamakom, the place, the land of Israel, may give you comfort amongst all the mourners. That even though you lost so much, look what we have today. Yehi Zechron Baruch, Yosef and David and everybody else that we have here. So the familiar sight that we have over here is like the alleyways of the old city that you can see, the arches and the alleyways, tight, and hopefully one day we'll be able to re-walk through these places together again. But you'll notice on the walls over here there are various different tombstones. They're not buried here in the walls. They're buried actually on the Mount of Olives. There's a whole other area there of a military cemetery there. And in fact, when it comes to Begin who passes away, Begin wants to be able to be buried with his soldiers who fought to hold on to Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, and he too is buried up there on the Mount of Olives. But we come in here to be able to show you one of these things. This is of a boy called Nissim Gini. He's the son of Miriam and Yitzchak. He's Nolad B'Yerushalayim. He's born in Jerusalem. His parents are actually Moroccan and from Tunisia. Nafal b'krav be'ir Atika. He fell in the battle of the old city of Yerushalayim on the 17th of Iyar, 1948. How old was he? 10. The youngest soldier to be buried in Har Herzl, buried here, is 12. But this is the youngest soldier who fought during the battles and died. He happens not to be buried here, as we said, but he died fighting for Jerusalem. He too has an incredible long story behind him. His father had a shop in Machane Yehuda, in the Jewish market. And he couldn't get back to Jerusalem because they'd cut off the old city. He was unable to get back in. This little boy was utilized because he used to play hide and seek in the old city. He knew all the alleyways. They used him as a messenger to run between the outposts, to pass messages, to tell them of what things he had seen on his way. And he'd run from one place to the other. His mother was blind. And the 4 kids that were at home looked after the mother, including Nissim Gini. Nissim, who hadn't been home all night, ran home for some lunch, was about to put the first spoonful into his mouth, when the officer ran into his house of Nissim Gini and said, "Listen, your replacement hasn't turned up. We desperately need you to come and help." His mother, who couldn't see but could hear the bullets whizzing past her house and the bombs landing in Jerusalem, begged the officer, "Please let him have some lunch, let him stay." The officer was happy to concede to what the mother wanted, but Nissim was not. If my soldiers, if my fellow members who are fighting to hold on to the old city need me, I have to go now. He ran out, unfortunately was killed at the young, tender age of 10. You know, we ask ourselves questions when you come to a place like Har Herzl. And if we look now at some of the tombstones that you can see here, 22, 23, 50, 45, 19, 17, 16, all these different ages that you have. We ask ourselves the question, when does it stop? That concept of the responsibility that I have to look after the state of Israel. But more importantly, when does it start? Wherever we may be in the world, one of the most important questions that we have to ask ourselves is what Avram Joshua Heschel once asked himself. He said, "We are involved in the greatest experiment of the Jewish people in the last 2,000 years. But he used the term experiment. An experiment means sometimes it's going to work, and sometimes, God forbid, it might not. But that depends very much on how much effort you put into it. Wherever we are in the world, how connected are we to the stories of what took place here? And it doesn't matter where we go today. When we walk around the cemetery, and we've been walking already for a while, but we're now continuing onwards, find one of those names, even of a person that we visited, or maybe something that you've seen along the way. Go on to the website izkor.org.il with an I, I-Z-K-O-R, It's in English as well. Take a name down and light a candle on this day for them. The sacrifice they made in order for us to have what we do today. So no visit to Har Herzl will be complete for me anyway, without coming to a place like this. Standing again in another area looking like very familiar to what you may have seen already in the video. But this is the grave of Yahshua or Yehuda Friedberg, somebody who was known in Canada as Jason Friedberg, somebody who till this very day, his basketball shirt stands in the Herzliya school in Montreal, above the basket, a basketball player. I got to know Yahshua, of course, many years ago because he died in 1993. And those of us that understand, we know that Purim is an exceptionally happy day. Outside of Jerusalem, they celebrate Purim, starting on the 14th of Adar. In Jerusalem, of course, because it was a walled city at the time of Joshua, it's a day later. On the 14th of Adar, which is the 7th of the 3rd, 1993, Yahshua Friedberg unfortunately fell in battle in the hills of Jerusalem. Yahshua used to come to our apartment. He was dating and engaged to an English girl at the time. And our apartment was very open. We had 3 guys that were living there, but there was always people in and out. Never really knew who was going to be in my bed if I come back from a long weekend away at a different place, who had slept there, whatever else it may be. And one of those people who came in to be close in the same neighborhood as his girlfriend was Yahshua Friedberg. And we got to know him. Yahshua was going to come to us for Purim Suda, to the apartment, group of guys who were going to celebrate Purim together. But he didn't turn up from his base. He was in the Golani Brigade, traveling on the way to Jerusalem. Seems like he got in a car of people that were dressed up as Jews. It was the time, unfortunately, of the kidnapping of Israeli soldiers. Arabs who would dress up as Jews, play Hasidic music from the radio, do their best not to speak so people wouldn't be able to hear their accents. But he was kidnapped. I don't think any of us that were involved will ever forget this night. Raining, thousands of people from all the yeshivot and the michalot, the year programs, walking over the hills of Jerusalem because Yahshua was so well known. He had this magnetic figure. When you walk into a room and you're drawn to somebody immediately, that was Yahshua. And Yahshua understood this beautiful idea of the idea of B'sever Panim Yafot, greet everybody with a smile. He also understood this idea of never judge a person. It didn't matter who you were, what you wore, what you looked like, whether you were in the clique or without, Yahshua would make sure you felt very much accepted. And I say always when I stand in a place like this that if only this hadn't taken place, Yahshua would be doing what I'm doing today. Educating people, educating youth, educating young adults. His dad was born, completely born for Yahshua. And I think testimony is as if you go around the different places in Israel where he touched, how many of them have a room, a library, different things that are dedicated to this man. As I said, on that rainy night, people went out to the hills of Jerusalem. People who knew him, people who had never met him, never heard about him. But that's the concept of Kol Yisrael Oivim Zelazeh, that all of Israel cares about one another. One of your boys is missing, you go out and find them. Went to the hills, they found his disc tag, his dog tag, which every Israeli soldier has. They have it in their boots and around their neck, so they can be identified, God forbid, if they get killed. We found the dog tag and we knew it must be nearby. When they finally found Yahshua, His gun had been taken, his uniform had been taken, and he was left for dead at the side of the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway. He never made it to Purim that year. You look around now, and I want you to imagine, just like every funeral, of all these soldiers that were here, but imagine Yahshua's. People on all the terraces around here, people everywhere, completely packed, coming into this place to be able to bury a man that some of them, as I said, knew and some didn't. His legacy lives on. His story is told by many. And the beauty of what this man stood for will be something that's imprinted on so many of us who once knew him. He was 24 years old after he made that dream to come to live in Israel, to study in Machon Meir and then come to live, be an Israeli soldier. But unfortunately, he paid the heaviest price. Yehi Zechor Baruch, may his memory be blessed. Yahshua Yehuda Friedberg, or Jason Friedberg as he was known in his childhood in Canada. So there are many famous people that are buried in Har Herzl as well, and one of them happens to be buried here. Okay, this is Yonatan Netanyahu, who happens to be the brother, of course, of Benjamin Netanyahu, the present-day Prime Minister of Israel. And next to him is David Elazar, who happened to be the Chief of Staff. But on the other side of him is a regular soldier, who really we should get to know the story with, just like every other story that there is of the people that are buried here. But let's focus maybe on this man over here, Yonatan Netanyahu. I'm sure there are many of us who have read the book Letters from Yoni, and other people who have seen the movie Our Man in Entebbe or Victory Entebbe or the other movies that came out, all describing partly his life as well. But my story with Netanyahu goes back to when I was a wee lad, because I happened to be very young when this took place. Of course, it's 1976, the whole story of Entebbe, which we'll talk about in a second. And I was young at the time, a little boy, growing up in London, but I knew the story of Entebbe, because who didn't know the story of Entebbe? Even if you were young, at the age of 7, you knew what was going on. Everyone had heard about this plane, the Air France plane that had been hijacked, taken to Uganda, the Jews being split, and the non-Jews being let to go. But the Sevet, the crew, stayed with, of course, the Jewish people. They had very little time to be able to prepare an operation. Netanyahu was an incredible soldier. He was a man who had fought in Sayeret Matkal, which was the crack elite troop of the Chief of Staff, a man who commanded them. And then after 1973, when of course Israel were bombarded, and the way that we were able to hold on to the country, at least in the north, was through the Air Force and through the tank brigade. Most of the tank commanders had been killed during that time. If you want to learn any more about this, you read the story of Victor Kahalani and the 7th Brigade and the 118th Battalion too, who managed to hold on to the Golan to stop the destruction of Israel. But there were no commanders. So Yoni Netanyahu decided to change, if you want, his occupation and became a tank commander to help out the tanks. But when the calling came again to go back towards this elite unit, he went back there and took upon himself and took a charge of being able to come up with an idea of how they were going to get into this place in Entebbe, in Uganda, and of course, free the hostages. Those Jews who were on their way to Israel, who were kidnapped. The kidnappers got on in Athens, and they unfortunately managed to divert the plane. Yoni was an exceptional commander. And I think that when we speak about leadership, we talk about this idea of dugma ishit, personal example. Personal example means that you don't request of somebody something which you wouldn't do yourself. You know, when I was in the Israeli army, I'll never forget, on a Motzei Shabbat, on a Saturday night, when we were training in the Golan, one of my commanders ordered us to pick up our beds and everything that we had and run with them in the mud and over the rocks and places that weren't lit around a whole yeshuv, around a whole community. He drove behind in the Jeep. The difference would be that Netanyahu would have run with his soldiers. He would have showed them that he too can carry what they're carrying. He would have showed them that, oh, if I'm asking this of you, know that I can do it myself too. And because he led by example, people were able to follow him ba'esh uvamayim, through fire and water. Remember, the concept of an Israeli commander is not kadima, you guys go first, I sit at the back, but it's acharai, after me. And that is why the first bullet that was shot and the first casualty that we took in Entebbe was Netanyahu. After these Hercules planes landed in Entebbe, after the fact that they'd managed to get hold of a Mercedes that looked like Idi Amin, who was the president of Entebbe's Mercedes, they managed to commandeer it. They left a note on the guy's door saying, we've taken your Mercedes. They didn't have them here at the time. They stole the Mercedes, they painted it black, they flew it across into Africa, into Uganda, landed it and drove towards the famous building that stood there with the watchtower, which then of course took the first pot shot at the soldiers, which killed Netanyahu. As I said, as a little kid, I used to run around with an umbrella tied to my back, pretending it was my gun and pretending that I was Netanyahu. A man who so many people grew up knowing his story and learning from his beauty of leadership and the letters that he wrote to his parents who were in America and to his brother Binyamin Netanyahu and to his girlfriend Bruria. When you open those pages, on every page, you learn so much, not just about the person, but about life, about the sacrifice that you make for the things that you hold dear to you. And what was possibly dearer more than anything else to Netanyahu was the land of Israel. A man who flew all the way to Africa to be able to free people, his own people. Because now you understand something. Many times we go to Poland with groups. And when you're in Poland, all of a sudden you see Israeli army soldiers there, dressed in uniforms. And you wonder, what are they doing there in their uniform? Marching through the death camps of Auschwitz and other places in their uniform, having ceremonies in their uniform in a foreign country. And even to the point that we were able to fly F-16s over Auschwitz as a salute to the people. Because as the pilot made his announcement from his aircraft down to the people who were on the ground, where he told the people of the death camp, those neshamot, those souls, I know that we're late, but we'll never be late again. We have a responsibility to look after Jews wherever they are all around the world. And the Jewish people should know, God forbid they're in trouble. There are people that will get on a plane and will travel halfway around the world to be able to make sure that they come back to safety. Netanyahu, that great hero of Entebbe. So we now come into the place of 2006, of course, which was of the Second Lebanon War. During this time of the Second Lebanon War, my unit was called up to the Syrian border, but there were many units that were called into Lebanon itself. One of those units, this man over here, was the Mufaked. Roy Klein, he was in charge of the Golani unit at the time. The son of Shoshana and Aaron, he was the son of Shoshana and Aaron. He's born in Ra'anana on the 2nd of Av, and it's an important day that you should remember, and he fell in the battle of Bin Jabal, which was a place in Lebanon, in Milchemet Lebanon Ashniya, in the Second Lebanon War. As you can see, there are various different things that are written on people's graves around, but this one and this one over here, but you can see, Hu'naklo ito ha'oz. Okay, he was given the greatest award of the Israeli army, a Medal of Valor for what he did. Because what's the story of Roy Klein that so many of us might be familiar with, but now as we stand in front of his grave, we can unite with that story. Roy Klein had already got a medal in the Israeli army. But Roy Klein, when he received the medal, he only invited his parents and one of his sisters to the award ceremony. And it was forbidden to speak about. That medal stayed under his bed. It wasn't put anywhere in his room so that people could see when they came in. Wow, amazing, kol hakavod, what you did in Shechem. Okay, how he saved people in Shechem, amazing, well done. No, not a word said. The guy was a completely modest and humble person. And at the age of 31, he went off to Miluim again. He went off to reserve duty again with his unit. He was in the area of Gaza, and then he was going up to the Lebanese border, to up north. He had a wife and 2 kids at the time, very young kids. Gilad and Yoav, if I'm not mistaken. And he was traveling up north. He phoned his wife. He said, "Do you mind if I come and see the kids? Come and see you." She was a bit hesitant because he used to pop in and out as a Mefaked Pluga, as the head of a unit. You don't always have that much time to be with your family. And she was like, you know, it's sometimes more damaging than good. You're coming in, you're going out, you're coming in, you're going out. The kids don't know whether you're staying or not. But by the time he got there, his kids were asleep. He was able to spend 25 minutes with his wife. He went in, gave a kiss to his kids, and he told these words to his wife. He said to her, "Eza kef, how lucky you are. I'm so jealous that you got this time with the kids. Eza kef, what fun to have the children in front of you." Got back in his car and he drove towards the Lebanese border. They entered into Lebanon, and Lebanon was mayhem. The Second Lebanon War, Hezbollah was shooting everywhere. And of course, as those of you remember, 1/3 of Israel's population moved to the south, clearing all the way below Haifa so it would be away from the missiles of Hezbollah. The Hezbollah dug tunnels. The Hezbollah had managed to be able to shoot very deep into Israeli territory and was shooting at the Israeli soldiers as they came in. One of my friends, who's a head of a tank unit, went to 13 different funerals on one day of members of the tanks of his unit that fell. 13 people in one day. They entered into the village which becomes now famous within Israeli history of Bin Jbal. And in that village they were being attacked. They took over a house, and all of a sudden a grenade was thrown into the house. Roy Klein saw the grenade. He jumped on the grenade to save the soldiers around him, not thinking about his wife and his kids, but understanding what it means to be a responsible leader. Not just in that moment of jumping on the grenade, but also of the last words he'll ever say in this world. He screamed out the words, "Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad." The famous Jewish anthem. The anthem that we have screamed day and night in various different places. The anthem that's taken us throughout all our history. The anthem of this idea of bringing a different type of world to this place, a world full of godliness. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Know the people of Israel, your princely nation. Know that you have one God. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. There were some soldiers around him at the time. And again, he led a unit that was not religious. There were some Jews who would consider themselves connected to the mitzvot, to the commandments, and other Jews who weren't. But when they heard him scream out those words, they felt it was like a punch in their stomach, as one of them said. And they had to say those words as well of Shema Yisrael. When you say those words this evening, he is one of many that are buried in this cemetery. We say it 3 times a day. But he's one of many that are buried in this cemetery who took their lives by falling on a grenade to save other people. I know of 5 of them here in this cemetery who did the same thing. Roy Klein used to learn 2 hours a day before he went to work. Roy Klein, one of the most modest people, and as his father said, after the funeral and after the shiva, if everyone would have known about the amount of fuss that Klein was around Klein's death, of him screaming out Shema, he wouldn't have wanted to die. Because his modesty has caused him so much, if you want, uncomfortable feeling that people speak about this man. Him and so many other people here are lessons to each and every one of us. And you know, we're surrounded here by different people, family members, who have come to visit their sons and their daughters as well, especially in 1948, where many women did fight in the end. Gush Etzion, the whole story of the Gush, women fought there. Incredible amount of women that fought there. But I want to tell you just one story of what happened to me when I came up here to see my Chavruta, my study partner, one of my study partners in yeshiva, who passed away, who was killed in Lebanon. I took a group up there and it was snowing at the time. And there was snow over all the graves. It was ones that were a little lower than where we are. There were ones on the graves, and you couldn't see the grave itself. You had to come along and clean the grave in order to be able to reveal the snow. You take away the snow to reveal the name. And I see this car pull up behind me. And this man get out of a tender van, a van, takes out these wooden stakes. He starts to bang 1, 2, 3, 4 stakes. Snowing quite heavily. We'd walked from the hotels of Jerusalem all the way here. And I think he works for Har Herzl. You can hear in the background people that are doing the same thing, working for Har Herzl. I go up to the man, I say, is everything okay with the grave? Maybe there's some subsidence, whatever it may be. And I see him taking out this plastic tarpaulin, this plastic sheeting, with a staple gun, starts to staple in the plastic around the different wooden stakes that he's put into the ground. One to the next, to the next, to the next. And then he turns to me, he says, no, I don't work for Har Herzl. So I said, well, what are you doing? And so he said, he's my son. And I don't want him to get cold from the snow that's falling. I've come here to build a shelter for him. If you want, that story hits home to the pain of the families more than anything else. They may not be physically here, but how do you get over that concept of burying your child? And I say this to any person. It doesn't matter whether it's a child that, God forbid, died of an illness, or children that gave up their lives for the people of Israel. Here, buried here. How do you get over the wrong course of nature? A child is meant to bury their parents and not the other way around. That pain is the pain that we feel here. It's the pain of loss of what could have been if these people could have been walking today, could have been teaching us today. Know that Yom Hazikaron is not a day for the families. That's every day for them. Every day. Yom Hazikaron is a day for you and me to remember these people, to remember the Shema Yisrael and other stories that we've heard. That's what Yom Hazikaron is about. The families have it every single day, every moment, every hour. Great hero of Israel, Klein. Yom Hazikaron comes to an end and it begins Yom Ha'atzmaut, the Day of Independence. And it's a tough time for everybody in the country. That transition, but doubly so for the families. Even though we spoke about the idea of Yom Hazikaron being for the people, and every day and every moment, but you move into this idea of Yom Ha'atzmaut, of the Day of Independence, of happiness, of joy, after you've dealt with so much sorrow. You remember the words that we're told in the Tanakh, Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami. Comfort me, the people, the people. God comes to comfort his people after the destruction of the temple. And if you want, after the destruction of so many lives, he comes again and gives that comfort of the state of Israel. The person who was adamant that this needed to be the way things had to be was the first chief rabbi of Israeli army, a man called Rabbi Goren. That you need to have Yom Ha'atzmaut connected to the day before, which was Daled Iyar, the day that Gush Etzion fell. The day that people who realized that you had to hold on at all costs to Jerusalem, they finally were killed and murdered on that day. And on that Friday afternoon, when Ben-Gurion declared independence, which started then, but officially at midnight, the candles that were being burned, or should I say the bonfires that you could see in the Hebron hills, were the hills of the settlements of Gush Etzion that were being burnt and the people who were being shot. And the largest mass grave we have in Israel is here in Har Herzl. But for me, Har Herzl, or the prayer of Har Herzl, or the scream of Har Herzl is here. Because behind me you see graves, fresh graves of Israeli soldiers. And then you come around here, see the grass patch, and you see a number of grass patches over here. And these are here, God forbid, to be filled. The prayer of Har Herzl and the prayer of the land and the prayer of the people is that these should stay empty. That I shouldn't have to dig more graves here. That I shouldn't have to work at being able to sort out there's enough space between the graves that families can stand. Shouldn't have to make the plans. Should be a time where I can come and sit on the grass over here and speak about the people that are buried here. And not have to walk between these tombstones. You are in a living cemetery from the perspective of the idea that unfortunately people are buried here till this day. And who's to say that even, God forbid, when we stand here at this moment videoing, that there won't be another soldier added to that list of names and that numbers that we have. Remember, there was a year which unfortunately during the Intifada they decided to strike hardest at us, and there was a bomb in Afula on Yom Hazikaron, in the bus station of Afula, which took the lives of soldiers on the very day that we're remembering each and every one of them. I want this to be empty. I don't want to add another number here. Wherever we are in the world, we know the price that we pay to have a country. But we also ask the question, ad matai? Until when we have to pay such a heavy price? We want to be able to do what we are as a people. As a people, we are a peace-loving people. A people that want to be able to bring shalom to the area, to the country, to the neighborhood, and to the world. To be able to be that light unto the nations. That God willing, one day, the eventual redemption will take place. And peace will be across the whole world. Let's hope from this place that we're standing in now, that the scene that you see now behind you will be the scene that we forever see. A scene of peace and tranquility, of green grass, trees that are growing, litzmoch, things that have grown out. Litzmoch, they've grown out of things which unfortunately, people who passed away, who brought us the gift of life to this place. God willing, this should be the scene. So the last spot that we come to now is connected to another whole story, but it really deals with, if you want, that movement from Yom Hazikaron to Yom Ha'atzmaut, even though I'm standing in a memorial. You'll notice that there are these black pillars everywhere, and on them are names in alphabetical order going throughout the whole park over here. There's also a group here that's sitting down and discussing what this memorial is about. The Aleph, the Bet, different times, different periods. The first time Ethiopian Jews tried to come to Israel was in 1873, with a man called Abba Mahari, who left from Ethiopia on a treacherous trek to get to Israel. But then in 1979, there was another time where Jews, Operation Moses, Operation Solomon, where they decided they're going to try and bring these people from the area of Ethiopia. Reminding ourselves of the pasuk that we have on the wall over here. Vaya bayom ahu Yosef Adonai shenit yado likno et shar amo. Okay, there'll be a time, as Yeshayahu says, where they will bring the remnant, shar amo, asher sha'er ba'ashur, those that stayed in Assyria, in Mitzrayim, umi Patros, umi Kush, umi Elam, umi Shin'ah, all these different places today that have different names, okay, all of Africa and Iraq and Iran, umi Iyei Hayam, from the islands of the sea. They'll all come back, this concept of kibbutz galiot, but the price will be very heavy to get them here. We know of the different types of operations that were brought to bring people to Israel. Operation Flying Carpet, to bring the Jews of Iraq and Iran, to bring the Jews of Morocco, okay, and every other place that we brought Jews in from. And also, of course, all the Jews that came in from Europe on various different ways. But then there's the story of Ethiopia. Because possibly there's no story like the story of Ethiopia, where one Shabbat morning, they got up after Shacharit and started their trek. And they trekked from their villages. As you can see around, we've got monuments here which remind us of the huts that they had in their villages and the reeds that were there. And they trekked towards the land of Israel, but they had to go through Sudan. Ethiopia was going through, at the time, a civil war. Fighting everywhere. Jews that were unfortunately walking through these places didn't have food, no water, walking through the desert. They would sleep during the day, hiding, and walk only at night so they wouldn't be found. But the reason there's no number of the amount of Jews that were killed on the way and didn't make it to Israel, either died of starvation, epidemics, or murdered by the bandits in the area, is because we don't know all the names. And we don't know everybody that left. So why put a number? Because there's many more that are left in those deserts, buried there out in the open. Why does it symbolize for us as well this concept of Yom Hazikaron, of the Independence Day? It's because of this idea of the ingathering of the exiles and that ga'agua, that desire, that yearning to be able to come back to their homeland. I'm sure that many of you are famously aware of that story of Napoleon, who walks into a synagogue on the 9th of Av, and he sees these Jews sitting on the floor, and he says to them, "What are you doing?" He says, "They destroyed our temple," they answer him. And Napoleon turns around to the Jews and says, "Who destroyed the temple? I'll beat them up. Who destroyed the temple?" He says, No, not yesterday. 1700 years ago, they destroyed our temple. Napoleon couldn't believe a people that held on to a dream. Shir HaMa'alot b'shuv Hashem et shivat Zion hayinu k'cholmim. The concept of returning to the land of Israel. Hayinu k'cholmim, we were dreamers. We could only dream of such a thing. But today, that dream has become a reality. Hayinu k'cholmim, we were dreamers. But we still do dream. Because the dream is that we'll be able to bring everybody back home to the land of Israel. At one time, to be able to come back, to bask in the glory of what this country has and what it's given to each and every one of us. And wherever you may be in this world today, in England and other places that might be watching, we should have a very, very heartfelt day of introspection on Yom Hazikaron. And when we come to Yom Ha'atzmaut, we should have a complete day of celebration, understand the miracle that we all live within every day. The fact that we live in this beautiful country that you can come to whenever you want, God willing, if there's no COVID. The fact that we've come back home, and with the heavy price that we paid, we're now standing in this beautiful place, being able to say, Hodu la Hashem ki tov, ki le'olam chasto. We give thanks to God for all the kindness that He's given us to be able to bring us back home.